Actually, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to those of you who reached out this week for this dialogue. I'm really glad to be together as so much is unfolding from one moment to another. I'm sure like many of you, the last few days has generated a whole host of feelings, pain, anger among them. But in no small part, I've been inspired by the swift and strong and really independent response of the public, particularly the leadership that young people are providing, who have taken to the streets to protest this latest police murder. And as well, I'm glad that some sort of national conversation is going on about the racism and oppression that has been a fixture of this country's history. At the same time, I'm sure I'm also not alone when I express a strong concern for the overall health of our country's democracy and state of affairs. Where will this public sentiment go? What can we build together? Clearly, we can't rely on the political leadership and government institutions that currently run the country. In fact, one can reasonably argue that's they're part of the problem. So I'm really looking forward to this dialogue. Needless to say, I think we're all here today because we think that Jackie Saillet, Independent Voting's president, is well equipped to lead us in that conversation. And Jackie has invited a number of very special guests to join her, whom she will introduce. If you have a question that you would like to ask, what you can do is you can write it in the chat, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And we will have some time for questions and answers after Jackie and her guests share their thoughts. So with that, let me turn it over to Jackie Saillet.
Great, thank you, Gwen. And hello, everyone. I'm really very glad to have this time together. Gwen, thank you, and thank you to the team that pulled this discussion together so quickly. We framed the topic, because when you put out an email, you have to have a topic or a title, or so Gwen tells me. And so I tried to pose this discussion or frame the discussion in terms of questions. Can we move forward in these difficult times? What does it mean to move forward? Even frankly, where is forward? One of the things I think about is not wanting to bring too many presumptions into a discussion and a consideration of where we are and what's happening. I've asked 3 special guests to join us for this conversation today. Michael Hardy, who is the Executive Director of the National Action Network and General Counsel to NAN and to Rivernell Sharpton. David Cherry, who is the leader of the All Stars Project in Chicago and the president of the Leaders Network, and Dr. Jesse Fields, who is a physician and a frontline activist for democracy reform. All 3 I considered friends and people to whom I turned for guidance and leadership and direction in many, many different kinds of situations. And I want to thank them for making time to participate in this conversation today. Before I bring each of them into the conversation, I just wanted to share a few things to maybe frame the dialogue a little bit, and also just share with you some of what I'm seeing, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling about all of what is going on, and maybe that will be useful in this conversation. So 3 things. The first is really a simple thing, and in a time where there's so much going on and there's so many layers and so many things to unpackage and so many things that are hard to assess. Sometimes it's useful to focus on a simple thing. And here is one. There is a very simple matter, a hard matter, a difficult matter, but a clear matter that is on the table, which is this. On May 25th in Minneapolis, there was a murder in broad daylight of a Black man, George Floyd, by a group of police officers. One of them, a white police officer, Derek Chauvin, kept his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes while he was handcuffed and lying face down on the ground. It was a violent act. It was a hateful act. And here's the simple point, it was a criminal act. It was a criminal act. And as such, it must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Now, let me just pause here for a second, because maybe you're thinking, well, that's true, but oh, she sounds like such a law and order advocate. I am a law and order advocate in this situation. I believe that the law must be used to deliver and render justice in this situation. President Trump says he's the law and order American. I disagree. President Trump, first of all, as far as I can tell, has no idea what law means, and very little interest in order. And even if he understands it, he doesn't believe in it. I do. I think there is a clear path to rendering justice in this situation, and it must be followed, not just because it's right, and not just because it's moral, and not just because it's the law, but because the American people are demanding it. That's a very serious thing, and I want to observe here, and many of the people on this call have been activists and advocates and crusaders and marchers for justice under the slogan, "No justice, no peace," for decades and decades. I think part of what we're seeing right now in our country is that no justice, no peace is not just a slogan. It's not just a sign on the stage. It's not even just a demand. It's actually a factual, objective description of what it is that is happening in our country today. No justice, no peace. Now, there is a lot to say about the legal process and the political process, and it's one of the reasons that I asked Attorney Michael Hardy to join us in the conversation today. I'm going to bring him in a minute, and as always, Michael is just a brilliant and experienced attorney and political person in these matters, and I think will be very enlightening to talk with him about that. My second point is this. There is so much emotion, so much passion, so much pain that is out in the open. And this, strangely enough, or maybe causally enough, I don't know, it's all out in the open while the country is still in lockdown due to COVID-19. Yes, this state is open, this one is opening up, we're in phase 1, phase 2, whatever, but the country is still in that mode. And while in lockdown, there is so much that is coming out into the open. And I think that part of what we're seeing in all of what is coming out into the open are that there are contradictions everywhere, and all of the mechanisms that have been built, the institutional mechanisms, the thought mechanisms, the cultural mechanisms, all of the mechanisms that normally reconcile contradiction or deny them or placate them are really proving to be invalid right now. So, I mean, I'm sure you're experiencing this just as I am. You turn on the TV and you see police or National Guard tear gassing or clubbing protesters, sometimes at the direct order of the president who just wanted to have his picture taken. And the next minute you're on social media and you see police officers taking a knee or joining a protest in Flint, Michigan, or you see a Black woman police officer restraining a fellow cop from using excessive force and pulling him to the sidelines to prevent a violent incident from occurring. There's contradictions everywhere. You know, because I'm in New York, the so-called epicenter of the pandemic, I often watch the Governor Cuomo, give his report and his status report on how things are going. And I think he's, generally speaking, been doing a good job in managing the health crisis. But he goes on TV and he says, the country is more divided than ever. Country's more divided than ever. And in his universe, the universe of the political class, the universe of the governing class, it's true. But in the lives of millions and millions and millions of Americans, I don't think that's true. I actually think that part of what's going on right now in the country is that people are trying desperately to find ways to come together. You see 100 doctors come out at 7 p.m., the time when they are being acknowledged for their work on the front lines of the health crisis, come out in Times Square, not to shine a light on themselves, but to stand up in support of the Black community and of the fight against racism and making a stand for justice. Everywhere you turn, this is what people are saying they want. For those of you that haven't yet read Antoine Joyce's column that was published yesterday in the Dallas Morning News, Antoine is the leader of the All Stars Project in Dallas and a national vice president of the All Stars, wrote an absolutely stunning, stunning piece about what it is to grow up poor and Black in America and the struggles that he has gone through and emerging as a leader and all of what he's seeing and feeling about both the danger and the opportunity that exists for Americans to come together. And I will tell you, I heard from Antoine that he's getting calls and letters and emails from people literally all across the country, many of whom he's never met, he doesn't know, many of them white, saying, I'm so glad to hear your voice. I'm with you. How do we come together? My third point, and then we'll move to my distinguished guests. I think one of the things that's happening right now is the American people are outgrowing our political institutions. Institutions that we built or that were thrust upon us and which we have tolerated for many years. But I think part of what is unsettling and different about what's going on right now is that the American people as a whole are way out in front of their leadership. And that is, I think it's an indicator of the extent to which the governing institutions, the political institutions, the conceptual frameworks, the language, words matter, all of that is being tossed aside for a search for new ways of defining what this country needs to be. And I think it's also fair to say that this movement or this phenomenon that's happening right now in the country, this is an independent movement. And here I'm not talking about how people are registered to vote or who they voted for or who they're gonna vote for. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that there is this wave of Americans looking for ways to give expression to their feelings and their beliefs about what this country needs to be. Joe Biden can go to Philadelphia and give a speech about what kind of country we should be. But the American people are in the process of defining that and redefining that. Hopefully he will follow, but the American people are leading right now, not the other way around. So justice, contradiction, growth, how do we build on all of that? That's our challenge. It's a big one. It's a big one. And I hope that our conversation today can open things up further and further equip us to go down that road. So let me start by bringing Michael Hardy, Attorney Hardy, in to this conversation. Michael, again, thank you so much. I know that you're involved in a million things, some of which you're going to tell us about now, but would you be so kind as to share with all of us your views on the prosecutorial process right now? Where are things out at? What are we waiting to have happen? And what is your view of how well is it going?
I think, well, first, let me say hello. Thank you, Jackie, and hello to everyone that is on with us today. Bring greetings from National Action Network, and of course, our president and founder, the Reverend Dr. Al Sharpton. I think it's very interesting where we're at. And I want to say in a nutshell that in terms of the prosecutorial process, it is actually moving quite swiftly. Now, of course, in Minneapolis, there's the call to arrest the other 3 officers and also the call to increase the charges against Officer Chauvin, who has been charged with 3rd-degree murder and some other charges. But I think if we look at the broad picture of this, and also put it in context with the other incidents that have happened in Georgia with Ahmaud Arbery, in Kentucky, in the Kentucky situation. In all of those situations, the perpetrators involved have been arrested and are going to be prosecuted. And of course, in the Minneapolis situation, again, the main perpetrator has been arrested, has been indicted with 3rd-degree murder, and the others are probably going to be indicted, or at least that's the word that seems to be out there. The Attorney General, who normally would not have, of Minnesota, who normally would not have jurisdiction of this matter, has been given jurisdiction to oversee the prosecution of this. And the Attorney General out there is Keith Ellison, who was a former congressman. For those that may not know, he's an African-American. He's a progressive. He was one of the leaders of the Sanders campaign in 2016, was also a co-chair of the DNC. And so in just a basic sense, the things that normally we would have to fight for, I mean, in the Amadou Diallo situation, we did civil disobedience for about 14 days to get the officers charged. And then once they were charged, there were manipulations to remove. That was a case that arose in the Bronx, New York, should have been tried in New York State and in the Bronx, but was moved up to Albany County. And many may know at the end of that process, those officers were acquitted. So you go from a point where when these incidents happen, where it was always difficult to even, one, to first get an investigation, and then to maybe get charges on an officer, and then to see those charges successfully prosecuted all the way through. Now, throughout the last 30 years, we've had some successes, and we've had a lot of prosecutions that have not ended successfully. But if you look at the arc, if you will, and to borrow a phrase, the arc of justice with regard to this has been in the direction of justice, and I think there has been so much fervor with the recent incidents that you would have to think that these prosecutions hopefully will be successful. Now, at the end of the day, the officers will be in front of juries. And of course, you can never predict what a jury is going to do. You don't know what other machinations will happen in between all of that. But the basic process of justice is moving forward. And that has not been something that we've had to fight for. Now, again, not all of the officers have been arrested, and that's certainly the cry out there for all of them to be arrested. And not all of the charges have been brought. That the family, in particular, the Floyd family, in the case of George Floyd in Minnesota, wants to have charged. But it's a process that I would say is moving forward and moving forward positively. And so again, in these situations, of course, you have the state that's responsible for prosecuting. And, can you rely on a Keith Ellison to do everything he can to do the right thing? I mean, you'll have large debates about that. You know, Keith Ellison, like many, is an elected official subject to all the things that any elected official is subject to. So, you know, we'll have to see. But I would have to say the process is moving in a positive direction. And certainly all the elements that are out there in the streets have continued to push that. And you also find from New York to Atlanta to Lexington, Louisville, Kentucky, everywhere, it's really interesting that you find even other police chiefs, police officers, rank and file officers who all say what they saw in the video death of George Floyd was horrible, horrendous, and criminal. And that is not even something that you witness with Eric Garner.
Right.
You have to remember that I Can't Breathe did not start on May 25th. I Can't Breathe started, 6 years ago in Staten Island, New York with Eric Garner. So again, I think we have to be very vigilant. I think the family is very organized right now, competently represented. Ben Crump is the attorney for the family, and of course, Reverend Sharpton and National Action Network are the spokespersons for the bulk of the family. And the funeral for the family will be on Thursday of this week at North Central College in Minneapolis. And I think in that respect, and I don't want to reach ahead of the conversation, you know, of course, there's a lot of politics in this situation, you know, a lot of violence that we've seen in the demonstrations and a lot to be discussed about that. But again, just purely from a prosecutorial point of view, it is moving more quickly than we have experienced in the past and that we've had to demonstrate for in the past.
Yeah. Well, that's, thank you for that. And that's a welcome picture. Michael, you're a longtime political person. You've lived through and been a part of and helped to instigate many of the changes that are bearing fruit now, shall we say. What's your view on the appetite for political change right now in the country, in different communities and among Americans as a whole? I'd really love to hear your perception of that from where you sit.
You know, I think the appetite is hunger. I think people really are hungry for change, and I think we see that in the streets, and I think we see that in the young people that are out in the streets, that in some respects are not indoctrinated into you know, the established institutional settings. I think they are outside of those traditional settings and are creating new boundaries, which is upsetting a lot of people. And of course, they may be making a lot of their own mistakes, but you know, that happens when you're growing. So I would say the appetite is great. I think that we can even see in this where you actually have a presidential election scheduled not far off in November, but you really have not felt the presence, frankly, of either of the parties or the candidates with regard to the election themselves. Of course, Trump is everywhere, but it's not so much him as the presidential candidate of the Republican Party. It's him as Donald Trump, president, making all of the actions that create all of the responses from people across the country. So I think that's very interesting. And of course, Biden is, you know, he's the presumptive nominee in a convention that no one even knows where it'll be, how it'll be. So we're in flux. And I think that both can be slightly dangerous, but also provide opportunity.
Yeah, well put. Michael, stay with us here. I want to move to David Cherry and talk a little bit about Chicago and some other issues and then come back to you. David Cherry, hi, how you doing?
Doing well, Jackie. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for joining us. And I know you've been out doing a million things. So thank you for, for taking the time here. David, you and I talked yesterday some, and you were telling me about an event that took place at police headquarters in Chicago that you, as president of the Leaders Network, and others were involved in. Can you give us just a quick report on that and how that's been responded to?
Yeah, and just I'll just say too, just one quick thing about the Leaders Network. It's a group of mostly ministers and activists, which organized back in 2005 to provide relief for victims of Hurricane Katrina, and then they stayed together because there's just so many problems in Chicago, and the work that the Leaders Network does follows a lot in the tradition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. King moved to Chicago in 1966 to really challenge a lot of the same issues we deal with today, the issues of racism and poverty. And he was not welcomed by the political establishment at that time, but and result of that is that these issues, have been going on for over 50 some years. So what we do at the Leaders Network, we fight for social and economic justice and challenge the political leadership because that's what they're supposed to be doing. But yes, we decided to make a trip to Chicago Police Headquarters yesterday. There was about 20 of us, some ministers and activists, and we were pressing the case. Much of what Michael was just speaking about, demanding justice, that all 4 of the officers in Minneapolis be arrested. And in addition to that, it would be something of, we would be derelict in our duty if we also didn't acknowledge, the horrible record of the Chicago Police Department when it comes to the Black community. And especially over these, last 50 years, whether it was Fred Hampton and Mark Clark of the Black Panther Party facing some 90 bullets in 1969, and no one went to prison for that, or whether it was Laquan McDonald being shot 16 times. We had to march endlessly to get some justice for that. Or the other case that we brought up yesterday was the case of that happened just the day after Christmas in 2015, where a Chicago police officer named Robert Riamo shot and killed a teenager named Quintonio LeGrier, and he also shot a 55-year-old grandmother named Betty Jones. They claimed that the teenager had a baseball bat. We'll never know because the only other witnesses are dead, but even if the teenager had a baseball bat, they admit that shooting the grandmother was a mistake and it was an accident. The problem with that is this same individual has never been brought to justice. And that's what these cases are all about. It's not just the act of the individual who commits these horrible crimes, whether it's in Chicago or Minneapolis or anywhere else, but the real protest is that we have elected officials, whether they call them state attorneys, district attorneys, county prosecutors, who seem to be unable to prosecute cases when the victim is Black. We know that the criminal justice system is filled with Black people, with Latinx people, with poor white people, even middle-class white people who do things to other white people. But when it's a Black person laying on the pavement, the same people who operate our criminal justice system seem to be all thumbs and have investigations that go on endlessly for 12, 13, 14 months. And then often it results in no charges. So it's really the lack of justice, which is the issue. So we call for police accountability, not only in Minneapolis, but police accountability in Chicago and across the country.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, and I want to ask you a question similar to the question that I just asked Attorney Hardy. Chicago's just been through a change of regime, and there's now an African-American woman mayor, Lori Lightfoot, and a new police superintendent, David Brown, who the All-Stars knows from Days in Dallas, and he's also very famous.
Yeah.
But here was a situation where, if you will, in the wake of the Laquan McDonald situation and the foot dragging and obfuscation, including the refusal to release the video by the mayor at the time, Rahm Emanuel, set the stage for a new political situation in Chicago with a new mayor and now a new police superintendent. And I know that you and others are in the process of reaching out for discussions with him. I know that he also was a keynote speaker at the All-Stars DSY graduation recently. So there's been a political shift already in Chicago. I'm wondering now, how do you see the appetite for political change and as expressed in these turbulent circumstances that we're in right now? You're a longtime political independent, and how do you see that?
Well, I know there's a real appetite for that. In fact, you may recall, Jackie, a couple of years ago, one of the Leaders Network ministers, Reverend Ira Acri, and I wrote an op-ed about Chicago as a tale of two cities. No matter what Rahm may say, and that's referring to former Mayor Rahm Emanuel. But I do know that there's a lot of there's a huge appetite to try to change what is happening in Chicago. For the poor community, whether it's Black or Latinx or poor whites or whoever is poor, it really is a different city. It's a beautiful city. It's one of our most world-class cities. And I say that as a native New Yorker, that Chicago really is a truly beautiful city. But then when you go into the poor neighborhoods, it's almost like you're going into some of the most impoverished parts of the third world. So people are either unemployed or underemployed. You have people who are working off the books who make less than $10,000 a year. Sometimes just shoveling snow in the wintertime or sweeping the floor in a grocery store. There's a real desperation that exists in Chicago that has been ignored for a long time. And again, it goes back to, what King was fighting for about the racism and the poverty. And that has just been ignored by administrations from Richard J. Daley, or his son, Richard M. Daley, to Rahm Emanuel. They act as if it's not a real thing. It's not a real thing that people are going to substandard schools, that there's a lack of affordable housing, that people are growing up with just hopeless. And so, even the other day with one of the stores that was looted, there was a woman who was dragging a mattress out of one of the stores, and somebody pointed out, even as much as people can get angry at the looters in this particular instance, what does it say about the desperation that you have a woman in the middle of the night, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of all the violence that was taking place, trying to pull a mattress out of a store by herself? But it's the desperation that has existed in Chicago for decades that has been condoned and tolerated, and in many cases just encouraged. And and then all of us who have raised these issues have been gaslighted for years, almost like, what are you talking about? Like, Chicago is fine. Well, Chicago has not been fine. And I say that whatever happens after this pandemic is over, whatever happens in the case of the officers, the one thing is that we cannot go back to normal, because normal was horrifying for poor people in the city of Chicago. And so I am hopeful that someone like Lori Lightfoot, can make the change. I know she had a poverty summit a few months ago, just before this pandemic hit. I know David Brown is another person as the new superintendent, wants to make some serious change, because he does know and understand the desperation of poverty, and and it's almost like a big battleship that takes a long time to turn around.
Right.
because there is a lot of opposition to making these changes, because to end poverty, it is going to cost some money, and everyone is going to say, well, we don't have that kind of money to invest. But so I really do support Mayor Lightfoot and David Brown, and one of the things that whenever we get a chance to sit with them, we want to express our support, from this community, that we're on the same team, because there's a lot of people who, in spite of everything in spite of all the rhetoric from our politicians, from many of our politicians, there's a lot of politicians who would not support Lori Lightfoot and David Brown in their mission to end poverty in Chicago.
Right. Well, I guess, and in a way, going back to some of what Michael was saying before about the environment around the criminal justice side of things and the prosecutorial side, we need to build an environment around those policy decisions and those choices too, that makes a clear-cut path that the elected officials have to follow. So, David, I'm going to move on to.
Oh, I just want to say quickly that the one thing for those of us who've been marching since the 60s and 70s and who march today, the idea of the marching was that we could get people elected into office so we would not have to continue to march like this in 2020.
Right.
And so our elected officials across the country have completely failed us. The idea wasn't to endlessly march and march. The idea was to elect people who would administer equal protection under the law and justice, right, so that the citizens wouldn't have to continuously march for justice.
Right, exactly. And I think that's so important what you're saying, and that really kind of raises the issue of what kinds of conversations can be had at what point about that very question. The strategy paths that were chosen 50 years ago at the National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana, for example, in 1972, which is probably what you're referring to here. How is that borne out? And how are the communities and how are activists feeling about those strategies and those tactics, and how do they need to be reconsidered? That's a really important question. David, stay with us. I'm going to ask Dr. Fields to join me now and talk with me about some of the front lines of the health situation. Jesse, are you with me?
I'm here, Jackie. Hi.
Dr. Fields, hi, how are you?
Good. Glad
Good.
to be with you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're with us today, and I know you're busy seeing patients and also doing a million things. So thank you for taking out the time to do this. I didn't, in all of the headlines that are going on now, I didn't want to lose sight of that we're still in a health crisis here. And this is something that you've been dealing with in a very direct way. Would you tell us what you're seeing in the frontline position that you're in, and how is it going?
Yes, as you know, I'm a physician practicing in the Harlem community, and I have been working in my entire career as a doctor in urban, underserved communities. I grew up poor in Philadelphia, and we lived above a restaurant that was really in the midst of the sub-economy of the Black community, that is drug use and the selling of drugs and all kinds of crime and prostitution. And so I grew up really very, very close to the conditions in which poor communities live and the kind of desperation that David was referring to. And I wanted to do something about that. And I know very well, very directly about the connection between growing up poor, poverty, and poor health. And I see that, of course, in my work in Harlem. And I think I just wanted to say, I think there is an important connection, which I'm sure you and others realize, between the violence and the killing of so many Black people and so many people of color by the police in this instance that we're talking about, George Floyd. And there have been other instances. Between that and the failure of our government and of our public policies to meet the health needs of people. And we see in the pandemic that it's like over 100,000 people have died in the pandemic. That number is growing. And I think that's something that we have to look at and examine, and also I think acknowledge the grief and the pain and the trauma that people have gone through during this pandemic. So I work as an outpatient physician, community health doctor in Harlem. We have a practice which is 5 physicians, and I'm one of them. 2 of them were sick with COVID-19 in the early stages in March in the pandemic. 1 was deployed to the hospital because the hospitals were overrun. They were just really overwhelmed with people. I had, and 1 doctor was on maternity leave, so I was covering myself. I was the only physician covering for 5 physicians at our practice. And I had many conversations with patients who were sick, who were frightened, elderly people who needed to go to the emergency room, had to be taken by ambulance because they were just too sick to stay home. Sometimes people would go to the emergency room and they would not be able to get in because they weren't sick enough, because they were able actually to speak, and the emergency room just couldn't handle people. So people were, I was talking to people who were at home and prescribing some medications, and many people survived. Many, unfortunately, did not. We have over 100,000 people in this country, as I said, who have died. So at the same time that there was this enormous crisis and people were very needy, I think there was also a realization in this country of the failure, the extent of the failure of the political structures of our government, of the parties, just enormous failure in terms of people not having what they need, medical personnel not having the kind of protective equipment they needed. So there's all that, which is still to some degree happening. Our healthcare system is simply not designed to meet the needs of the American people. At the same time, I wanted to just express my solidarity with all the movements that we've been talking about, and fundamentally with the people of this country and with the people of Harlem, because my experience every day, especially now, is that people are enormously grateful for my being there. I mean, they came to the practice because that's what was there. I had patients who live blocks away, half a block away. One elderly woman who just walked in, she wasn't feeling well, and I did the test and it came back positive, and she survived, but she never, she wasn't admitted to a hospital. We stayed in touch. There were many cases like that, and many people that I was talking to who had parents, elderly people who were in the hospital, in intensive care. They could not see them. They haven't been able, because of the infectious nature of the coronavirus, you can't see a person after they get admitted to the hospital. So I've seen all this, and I think that the pandemic, as well as the violence, the police violence and the police killing, the many of them against Black men and women in this country, and other people of color and other poor people, I think the country, what I'm seeing is that I think we're going through a tremendously painful situation, and also a situation in which these crises, which have been going on for a long time, are being revealed and exposed, and people have made a decision and are deciding we cannot tolerate this enough. We are not going to allow this to continue to happen, and I think that is a growthful moment, and I think we need to continue to move forward, and we could talk about that. I think one of the things I feel very proud of is the need for caring and compassion in medicine, and the need to do away with corporate control and for-profit, and the fact that people can't get decent health care unless they can pay for it, the whole insurance domination of medicine. I think we can see that is just fundamentally immoral and is not working, and is dangerous to the health of the entire country.
Jesse, thank you. It must be an incredible comfort to your patients to be able to see you and receive treatment from you, and also to just be with you. So I thank you. I thank you for giving that to the community. It's just very beautiful, very beautiful. I think what I want to do now, I had some questions I wanted to go back to the three of you with, but in the interest of time, we really have just 10 minutes left before we want to get back to work and other things. So Gwen, I know you've been curating, or would you curate for us some questions from people who are on the call and give people an opportunity if they would like?
Sure, yes. Right now we have 2 questions that have come in. So why don't we go first to Steve Huff, who's the chair of the Florida Fair and Open Primaries. Steve had a question about the implications of the Minnesota case. Steve, you there?
Yes. Can you
Hi,
hear me?
Steve.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, briefly as possible. You know, living in Florida, Trayvon Martin, the case that happened 6-7 years ago, was you know, such an obvious failure in the justice system in that case. And then shortly after that, you know, we had the Michael Brown case in St. Louis. And that was the first time that I was aware of that they released transcripts of everything to the public. And I spent days reading through that and writing up what turned out to be a 75-page summary of my thoughts. And again, I just, you know, justice was not served. And then there was a string seemed right after that. And so many times we see these things, like I mentioned in my question, it's similar, the reactions and the political fallout is similar to what happens when we have mass shootings in this country. And then, you know, things quiet down until the next one happens. So my question is, if now that Robin shared that the other 3 have been charged and arrested, if they're all 4 tried and convicted, will this possibly be the impetus to break that cycle?
Well, I think it certainly could be. I mean, you have to remember, you know, there have been successes. And I think the interesting thing in all of this, there's always the machinations of the institutions. So in the Trayvon Martin case, one of the critiques, and the same happened in the Sean Bell case in New York, is that the prosecutors themselves did not try the case that they should have tried. They didn't focus on all of the things that they should have focused. So you may argue there that it was the institution and the prosecutors that failed that prosecution, and the jurors was left to vote, you know, based on their reasonable doubt. I hopefully we'll see a very different, smart, more aggressive prosecution with regard to all of the cases that are happening now, both in Georgia, Louisville, and Minneapolis. And we'll have to see, but a lot of that really depends on the people in the driver's seat and how the prosecutions are put together. And you have to remember, we have had successes, even here in New York. Justin Volpe, who sodomized Abner Louima in a precinct full of cops, is still in jail in Minnesota at the Mayo Clinic, or at least that's where he was the last time any of us knew. So again, I think a lot of it is how it's done. That becomes important.
Yeah, I agree with the Trayvon Martin case. That a lot's been said about the charges and the prosecutor foul up there, but you know, there just seems to be so many of these cases where the perpetrators, if you will, either are not charged or convicted at trial. So hopefully, this one they'll do it right. And this will maybe send a message, the shockwave through the law enforcement community, that this is what happens when you do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
my hope anyway. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah. Gwen?
Questions are starting to come in. Okay, well, I would like to go to Al Bell, who actually sent in a question in advance. Al is from Arizona. Al, can you unmute yourself? It was off of Antoine's great article.
Yes,
There you are.
I was very impressed by that article, as I'm sure we all were. In part of it, he said, Colin Kaepernick's knee, and now the one that murdered George Floyd, also exposed a festering hate, a hatred that still inhabits our nation, a hatred that is deep and brutal. Pretty strong words. Well, precise confirmation of Antoine's words now exists, including where hate is strongest. And if anything, that confirmation indicates that Antoine may understate it. Given that, the question is, how do we deal with the deep and brutal hatred of Black Americans that is embedded in so much of America and still make the progress we seek?
Can I respond?
Yes.
So I think that's a very important question, Al. And I think that it is not something that is easy to do, and we have to take risks. I think one of the things overall that we have to do is we have to be vigilant, we have to be involved in everything that's happening right now, and at the same time, be activists who see history which continues. So violence on Black people has been the practice of America since slavery. It is deep and it is brutal. All kinds of people, however, right now, people of all races are protesting that and are deeply committed to stopping the violence. But our government is not deeply committed to stopping it. In fact, the government doesn't function based on the desires and convictions of the American people. So we, as a people, I think, need to come together, and Antoine suggests in that article, having conversations led by young people that will be hard conversations, but I think we can have those conversations using the skills of performance, and the All-Stars has done a lot of work in helping people from diverse communities, rich and poor, come together and develop. But there has to be a development in what democracy is. It's not simply, democracy is not elected officials making superficial gestures to maintain their constituency. Government has to be closer, has to have a closer relationship, a direct relationship to the people, to all the people, and to the conditions in which people live. It has to be really, as Lincoln said, government has to be of, by, and for the people. So we have to have our collective experiences, including everything that we're going through right now, and all the reforms that we support as independents and as a movement have a soul. The reforms we support have a soul, and that soul is the lives of the people. It's the soul of the African-American community. That soul is independence of all races, building a new democracy. I think that's what we have to do, and nothing less.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you.
Okay.
Gwen?
Okay, we have just a few more minutes left, but I'm gonna ask these two questions that Sue and Marion asked together, because I think they could probably be addressed together. Sue asked, given that the American people are making a new statement, how do you create something off of that that changes what happens in November with the next election? And Marion asked, interested to hear Jackie and the panelists talk about how national leadership can emerge outside of the political class, and what is the role of our movement of independence? Would you like to take that, Jackie?
I would. In some ways, I think the answer to that is, well, this is the work that we do every day, which is to, in some respects, first and foremost, to elevate the visibility that there is an outside. And, you know, others who've spoken here, David and Jesse and Michael, in different ways have pointed to that there's so much of what is happening today is extra institutional, is filling the vacuum left by the absence of leadership from the existing framework. And we've got to leave room for that to happen, for that to emerge, and then we've got to work hard to give it a kind of coherency and a kind of organizational shape. There's no easy answer to that, but look, the fact that what is being revealed, everyone here is talking about the things that are being revealed. One of the things that's being revealed is that millions and millions and millions and millions of Americans are not relying on the existing political framework to give expression to how they feel and to what they want to have done. That is a big shift that's going on. That's a huge shift in the country. And I think we have to support that. I think we have to not be afraid of it. And I think we have to cultivate it and then to build inside of it and with it. That's a tall order, I know. And let me ask Jesse, David, and Michael to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I think the moment is there. And if I could, I had the honor to write a law review article with Harry Kresge and Jeremy. And, in that article, we look at this pattern that Jesse was speaking about. But we also see that we're at a point now, and I think you said this, Jackie, where the institution just may not be able to control what is happening. And it's got to open up. It's got to be busted up. It's got to be open. And I think voters and what happens, even in the 2020 election, in terms of do we really let people vote? If we vote, we win. But if we are prevented from voting or locked out of voting, then the nation loses as a whole.
Yeah, and I think we have to look at how do we create new relationships and new coalitions. Sometimes the conventional wisdom from a lot of people is, liberals get together with liberals, liberal Democrats get together with themselves, and conservative Republicans get together with themselves. And, and I think about, one of the things that happened last week too was that video of the woman in Central Park who was calling the police on this man who's a bird watcher, Audubon Society. And, it turns out that she's a liberal Democrat who's contributed to Barack Obama, to Hillary Clinton. So I think it's a mistake for people to just organize based solely on the left, center, right paradigm. That one of the things I've found through doing this work with independentvoting.org, with the work that I do with the All Stars Project, is you have to create environments where people can voluntarily decide this is where I want to be with the diverse group of people. Certainly in the All Stars Project, we have, white business people who, sometimes white Republican, conservative business people who have been very generous supporters of our young people in the All Stars Project. And during the time, since I've been at independentvoting.org, I've been in so many settings where progressives and moderates and conservatives have worked together on the issue of democracy. It's like, well, whatever our social positions have been, it's like when you get to the issue of democracy, we find ways, in fact, to work together on that vital project. So I think we have to, and this is what we do. We have to create environments where people will voluntarily come together and create some new, something new out of that.
Thank you. I would just add to that, I think we need to change our understanding or expand our understanding of leadership. So the American people right now are providing a great deal of leadership. And I think that's a good thing, that that leadership is coming from the grassroots, from ordinary people, all kinds of people. And the important thing to me, I think, one of the important things that we can do is to help those voices to be heard. I think that our work in terms of the reforms that we're working for, the real vital importance of those reforms is for communities to be able to express themselves and to be able to impact on what happens in their lives and what happens in their communities and in our world. So I think it's important that we continue to focus as we have been on the grassroots organizing, on different people talking to each other and building and continuing to build and taking everything we can from this moment and going forward with it. And perhaps most importantly is to always bring in that human connection, because I think that has a great impact of different people coming together and sort of redesigning our democracy, are having a voice. That is very important. We cannot simply give our politics over to the people who are in charge, to the elected officials. Our politics is what we're doing at the grassroots and what we're building. That is our new politics that we're developing. I think we need to move forward with that understanding and not attribute all the power and influence to them. They have a great deal of power, but we have on the ground, among ourselves, among the people, a great deal of power. I think we should learn to appreciate that and sort of be connected with what we've done so far and what we can do historically, that we can do much more if we continue building, continue organizing. The spotlight may not be on the positive things that are happening or the peaceful demonstrations, but we need to go forward and to bring everyone together to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, David, and Jesse, for sharing your time and your leadership and your thoughts and your amazing strength. It's meant a great deal to me over many decades' time and continues to be so. And I'm watching the chat room here, and I think a lot of people are feeling the same way. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. We're going to keep it going in a whole variety of formats here. And if you haven't visited the independentvoting.org website recently, please give us a little visit. If you have a minute and you haven't taken the survey that we have up, please take the survey there. Stay in close touch and be safe, everyone, and take care. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.